I am Butch Conrad. I am First Vice District Governor of District 31I in North Carolina. Our presenter is Chris Lewis. I'd like to tell you a little bit about him. Chris joined the Lions Club of Gravenhurst, Ontario in 1999. He has served all positions in his club, including President, Secretary, and Treasurer. He served as District Governor of District A12 in 2013-14. District positions have included Internet Technology and Promotion and Public Relations, along with Global Membership and Leadership. He has served as District and Multiple District Global Membership Team Coordinator and is currently the Global Membership Team Area Leader for Eastern Canada. Chris is a graduate of both the Lions Club's International Senior Lions Leadership Institute and the Faculty Development Institute. He has been a presenter and moderator at many district and multiple district training events and the USA-Canada Lions Leadership Forum. He served as a facilitator of the Advanced Lions Leadership Institute in Calgary in 2015, and I know that's true because he was one of my teachers. Outside of Lionism, he's employed by McDonald's Restaurants of Canada in human relations, in human resources, operations, and training. And Chris is married to Lion Margie, and they have 2 children together. Our presenter then is past District Governor Chris Lewis.
Thanks, Butch. I really appreciate that. Can everyone hear me down in the back? Yes. Can you hear okay? Perfect. So, I might wander a little bit, so that's going to cause some videography issues, I'm sure, if I run pretty quick, but I'm sure we'll work it out. So. Yep. Let's start off. Who has participated in a webinar in the past? Pretty much everybody, I would think. Have you enjoyed them? Have you thought they've been worthwhile learning experiences, ways to learn and really get something a little bit different than you've done before with some face-to-face training?
Yes.
Yes. Who has put on a webinar or hosted a webinar in the past? Probably a few less hands, eh? Just a few. For those of you who have done webinars and conducted your own webinars, have you discovered it's a little bit different than teaching this way? It's a little bit different. You know, you've got an audience, you've got people you can see and interact with, and so on. Instead, you're talking to a box. It's a little bit different. So we're going to talk about some of that stuff today and some of the differences between teaching and doing training this way and teaching or training over the internet instead. We're going to review the differences and the benefits between those 2 types of training. And when we're talking training, we're talking either webinars, maybe even online meetings or training in some ways, maybe a little bit smaller. We're going to talk about some of the benefits to using webinars in some of your training when you go back to your districts and your multiple districts. And we're going to review the basic webinar management interface so that you have an idea and you'll get a better understanding when you host your first webinar what some of those little boxes mean on the screen, because they look a little bit different when you're hosting one than they do when you're participating in one. And then finally, we're going to share some strategies that you can use to make your webinars better and to keep the participants and the people sitting in on the webinar a little bit more engaged. Because that's probably, I think, one of the biggest challenges we have. I should mention that the session is being recorded and will be uploaded after the forum to the Lions University site and the forum site. And this is a Lions University course, so by sitting in today and then answering the quiz, and if you want the answers to the quiz, I take folding money, and preferably American folding money, because the Canadian folding money is nowhere near as valuable right now. And besides, the Canadian has way too many coins, so those aren't nearly as exciting as the big folding money. So if you want the answers to that quiz, which will also be online at the Lions University website, you can send me some cash. And then when you complete that, this is a doctorate level class. So webinars and online training versus sort of traditional training. Some of the differences. I think, obviously, the difference between traditional training, which is done in a workshop style like this, versus one that you would do online, is you need an internet connection. And I think the internet connection has to be pretty reliable, and in most cases, you'll get the most satisfaction out of your webinar experience by using a high-speed broadband internet connection. Does anyone live in places where the internet connection is a soup can and string kind of style? Yeah, so that can exhibit some challenges, I think, when you're in a situation like that. Yeah. I'm from Ontario, and in northern Ontario, that is the type of internet connection we have. And they struggle sometimes in doing some online training just because the internet connection speed is just so poor. So you have to have a reliable high-speed internet connection. Some webinar hosts allow you to phone in and listen to a webinar, but to really to host, you'll lose some of the visual on the screen unless you have that really effective high-speed internet connection. Traditional training, like this one, many of you either drove or flew or maybe local might have walked, involves driving to a central location and then receiving the training. Well, webinars and online training can be done in the comfort of your own home, on your own computer, or on your own tablet. Some smartphones will work too, depending on how up-to-date they are. Weather and road conditions aren't a problem. As I said, I come from Ontario, so in northern Ontario, a place like Minnesota and so on, we get some pretty brutal weather. So if you're driving to a face-to-face training session or a traditional training session, that can definitely limit the number of people that can participate in your training. Although some webinar participants will still travel and they'll go to a central location, and this can alleviate some of the soup can and string internet if they can go to a central location and participate in a webinar or host a webinar sort of in a central location where you have several people all participating, watching it on a big screen, almost like watching a football game, I guess. And that can help alleviate some of those internet challenges. Obviously, webinars are way cheaper. There's a cost for all of you to be here. There's meeting room costs, everything else. Webinars, although they're for professional packages of webinars, there is a bit of a cost involved. For the most part, they are virtually free for participants and to participate with. No gas, no meals, all that stuff. Saves time. When you travel to traditional training, you've got time in the airport, you've got time on the road, you've got all those other things there. So it definitely is a little more, a better use of your time. The really good thing about webinars and online training is they're repeatable. This session's being recorded. People who couldn't sit in today and couldn't come here today can then download and view this webinar at a future time. They might not be able to raise their hand and ask questions and so on, like they would here, but they'd be able to repeat it and do it again and again and again, which then allows you to cascade it amongst more people amongst your district. So what do you think the number one benefit to webinar training is, or online training? Anyone know what the number one benefit is?
Convenience. Yeah.
What else?
Cost effective.
Cost effective, yeah.
Wider audience.
Wider audience, yeah. You can reach out to more people.
Yep.
I've done webinars in my own district. We do district membership webinars. And I've invited people from all over the world to sit in. And I've had people from all over the world. So yeah, wider audience. The number one benefit to webinar training is pants are not required.
Yes, that is it.
If I came here today and wasn't wearing pants,
leave.
You would leave. Well, I could stand behind here, you wouldn't know. Not you. No, but pants are not required. Although, if you're hosting a webinar and you choose not to wear pants, I strongly recommend you stick a little piece of electrical tape over your webcam,
Yeah.
or make sure it's off. So that is the #1 benefit to webinar training. So we have lots of service providers that do online training and online webinars and so forth. You know, we have companies like Uvu, we have Genesis is another popular company that does webinars and so on. Adobe does Adobe Connect. Even Skype for smaller meetings, you know, or some training sessions you want to do maybe with just a handful of district officers, you can do it in Skype.
Oh.
Get them to log in, you can still do some of that stuff on that way. But the one we're going to focus on today is Citrix GoToWebinar. GoToWebinar is used by LCI webinars, it's used by my own multiple. It's not free. It's about $1,000 or so a year, give or take. Probably $1,000 Canadian and 600 American. But anyway, so it's about $1,000 a year, and our multiple purchases a GoToWebinar account every year in order to share it amongst our districts for our districts to use, and we also share it with neighboring multiples as well when they need to use it. So
Yeah.
It's $100 a month.
about $100 a month. So,
Yeah.
so it's probably $1,000 US. So we're going to focus on the GoToWebinar interface. So there's a couple of things with GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar with Citrix. GoToMeetings are smaller. You only have about 20, 25 people max can participate in a GoToMeeting. Whereas a GoToWebinar can be up to 1,000 people participating. And which would be a very unwieldy thing for people to host as a webinar that large. It could be very difficult, but it has the capacity to go up to about 1,000 people. GoToMeeting as part of it, and when you purchase the GoToWebinar account, you get GoToMeeting included. So, it has no pre-registration, so you could just send out the link saying I'm having a meeting at such a time, and then people can just join right in. But with a webinar, you need to have pre-registration where people pre-register to attend. And there are some benefits to having people pre-register as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit. GoToMeetings, people can just dial in and listen to the meeting and listen to the training without really looking at the computer. GoToWebinars, generally you have to log in first using your computer, and then you can dial in with your phone if you so choose. But for the most part, you need to have a computer. And most people who do a webinar would tend to have a slide or a presentation on the webinar, so you want to be able to see it anyway. So it's a little bit more effective using a computer. So webinars have 3 roles. There are 3 different types of people that are involved in a webinar. Those 3 are your organizers, your panelists, and your attendees. So the organizer schedules the webinar. The organizer starts off and says, we're going to do a webinar next Thursday at 4 p.m. Only the organizer can schedule the webinar. The organizer then invites the attendees to attend the webinar. He sends out invitations, they say the webinar is going to be at 4 o'clock, here's the link to register, that kind of thing. And then finally, the organizer, once the webinar comes around, the organizer starts the webinar and says, okay, we're ready to go, and everyone else is muted, and then you start off. That's the job of the organizer. And some of these terms are kind of important because when you host your first webinar, it'll ask you who your organizers are, or who your panelists are, and so on. So it's kind of important to know what their roles are. Panelists, on the other hand, they're able to share their screen. So when they're given authority to, they can take over the screen and they can display the screen. They can speak during a webinar. At the start of a webinar, the only people who can talk are the organizer and the panelists. All the attendees are muted, which is probably a good thing if you got 1,000 people yapping, right? So you wouldn't want that. So they're all unmuted. You can unmute them when you want, but for the most part, panelists and organizers are the only ones who speak during a webinar. Panelists can also answer questions. Two ways questions can be answered during a webinar are raising your hands, which will then allow a panelist or someone to unmute that person and listen to what they're saying, or an attendee can type in their question in the question and answer pane. And when they type their question into the question and answer pane, then the panelists can type in and answer that question, or they can mention to the presenter, hey, you know, Joe from Minnesota has a question. You know, and then they can either read it out or whatever. So panelist is a big helper by answering the questions on behalf of the organizer or the main presenter. And then finally, you have the attendee. These are the people that are participating in the webinar. They can watch the webinar. They can participate in the webinar. And then they again can ask questions through their Q&A panel. So let's look a little bit through the interface of once you log into the GoToWebinar interface, you can see some of the things on how we're going to start and schedule set up your webinar. So when you log in, you'll get a screen somewhat like this. You can see I already have a webinar scheduled for October 4th. If anyone would like to join in, it's all about creating excellence with your clubs and your club service project. So once you go to create the webinar, you get a screen where you just simply type in the information for the title of your webinar, description, and so forth. If you've already done webinars in the past, you can start a webinar and set up a webinar using one that's already done. It's already pre-configured for you. Some of the benefits is you can do some logos and that kind of thing with it, so it's nicely set up. So you can either choose a previously done webinar as your starting point. Then you enter your description. And the description you enter will be on the registration page and in the confirmation emails. Then you set the time up for the webinar. And if you're doing a webinar that's outside your district or outside your area where it's going to go beyond maybe a district or in, you really want to make sure you put the right time zone in, because that will make it much more effective for participants outside Ontario or outside your area. I do webinars that are coast to coast. So there's a big challenge if you don't put the correct time zone in when you're selecting the webinar. People won't know exactly what it is. They'll think it's 7:30 their time. So the time zone is pretty important. So we already have my webinar all set up. I'm a big beer fan, so I'm here in Beer City, USA. So my webinar is titled Beer City, USA. And we're all going to be talking about all the great things that happen in Grand Rapids, which mostly involve beer. So we set up our webinar. It's only going to happen once. It's going to happen today from 10 to 11. And you'll simply click the schedule button at the end. So it's pretty straightforward. You just follow the step-by-step. Then as soon as you click the schedule button, you will get it's kind of like a webinar detail page, and it's kind of a summary of the entire webinar that you've just started and scheduled to occur. On this, you can add the webinar right directly to your calendar on your computer. You can customize the registration screen that your participants will see right on this screen. You can put logos in, you can change the font and make it a little bit more interesting for when your participants register for their webinars. So you can make it look a little bit more professional, a little bit more suited to you and your own district. You can also, at this point, assign other people to act as organizers. One person schedules the webinar initially, but you might have other people that you want to take that role on. You can also schedule people or assign people to be panelists, people that might be speaking during your webinar for different things. Something that I tend to do when I do a webinar is I try to get a person to help me. So that when I'm presenting a webinar, I get someone to monitor and sort of moderate some of the questions coming in. Because it's a lot of work. talking and teaching or whatever. And, I've got people talking about, hey, I can't hear anything. Maybe the person can help you answer those questions. So by assigning a panelist as almost like a moderator to your webinar is a huge help. So you can assign them, and you basically just click the edit the panelist, and you can assign their email address so that when they register, they'll get an invite to be a panelist. So having one or two panelists who have a little bit more authority during the webinar is a huge help. And then you can just copy the registration link, and then you can send it out yourself, or you can post it on Facebook or whatever other way you use within your districts and your multiples in order to communicate that you're doing a webinar. So you can just send that link out, and then people that want to attend your webinar have to click on that link, and then they can register and get all the information they need to do. On this confirmation page, there's the ways that you can edit the type of email correspondence that your people are going to get from setting up the webinar. So you can change whether they get confirmation messages, you can change whether they get a reminder a little bit before the webinar. That's pretty important because generally speaking, you get lots of people register for a webinar and a lot less show up to participate in the webinar. So unless you have a mechanism to kind of remind people that, hey, you have a webinar next month, people will forget. So unless you have a mechanism where those people can get a little message sent to them a week before, hey, don't forget you have a webinar coming up next Tuesday night. You can configure that so that they get those messages on a timely basis. And if you kind of want to do one little kickstart yourself, you can actually log in and send out a one more reminder message kind of thing, just to say, hey, we got this webinar starting in 3 hours, so that it really gets people to remember that, oh, geez, I was supposed to do that. I got to get the computer turned on, get all logged in, ready to go. So,
Chris?
Yeah?
When you're sending out the message, like as people register, does that give you an email list that you can then
Yes.
go? Sorry.
Yeah. So you get a full list of all the people that have already registered. And you can log into the interface and see, I already have 10 people registered, 20 people, 30 people, that kind of thing.
But your reminder would then go to all those people on that
Yes,
list?
whatever way you've configured it in the message.
All right.
Yeah. So it's really kind of handy. It does a lot of the work on the back end for you, rather than trying to do the thing. Think of it, if you were doing traditional training, what would you do? You would send out an email or whatever, or mail something out saying we're having a training meeting. Can you let me know if you're coming? And if your district is like my district, you would get 3 people reply. And then you pick up the phone and you phone a bunch of presidents, and then you say, I need to know who's coming, and so on and so on and so on. And then you get a few more people call you back. Right? Is this how your districts do? Is this pretty much how it happens in your districts all the time? We have 780 some odd districts in the world. I bet you everyone's exactly the same. And we have to do all this stuff. So, this automates a lot of that process for you when you do this type of training, because it sends that stuff out automatically, so you don't have to keep chasing them down. You will still get some people unable to attend the webinar they've signed up for. That's okay. I once read a statistic. It's something like 25% or 30% of webinar participants don't show up for the webinar. So if you're planning on 50 people coming, you'll probably only get 35 or 40. This is a good spot here, engaging your attendees. When you set up your webinar, you can actually upload things such as handouts. So the handouts are available once the person logs into the webinar and the webinar starts. You can distribute those handouts in advance if you really wish, but that's kind of nice. When they log in the interface, they'll see a spot where they can download the handouts that you've already assigned for them. So it's nice having it all there when you do the webinar. You can create polls and surveys so that you can have polls all ready to go for when you run your webinar. You just launch the polls that you've pre-created. And that's a way to kind of interact with your people. Right now, if I wanted to interact with you, what could I say? How many people like loggers? You can raise hands. How many people like ales?
Oh, okay. Wasn't sure if you meant tree cutters or beers.
Loggers.
What's the subject?
So,
Be specific.
yeah, we're
I'm
talking
sorry.
beer, right? So
Right.
anyway, so we can get that interaction just simply by looking around the room and that kind of thing. But in a webinar, you don't have that sort of capability to see people and interact. So using polls and different ways to engage people, you can preset those polls up. But I strongly encourage, if you're going to use polls and so on in a webinar, make sure you use the information for something useful. Don't just toss the poll out there and move on to the next slide kind of thing. Make sure that you debrief the poll and use the information from it pretty effectively. So, developing your webinar content. We've already talked a little bit already about how to start up the webinar and how to schedule the thing right from the beginning. But now we want to talk about developing your webinar content, and this is a little bit different than what you would do in a presentation like this. First thing you want to do is you want to make a connection. Right now, you can see me. You know what I look like. You know, if you run into me later on, you might remember me, or you'll say, that's that guy I don't want to ever be in a presentation with ever again. But yet you get a little bit of a personal connection during face-to-face training. But you kind of lose that a little bit in online training, or it's possible to lose it. So if you did a webinar like this, it's got the title on it, it's got a slide, it's got my name, would that be fine for traditional training like this? Might be fine, because you're seeing me, right? On a webinar, would that be a little bit better? And that way you kind of put a face on the person that's giving the message, talking to you. Something as simple as sticking a picture on the slide where you introduce the presenters and the panelists and those sorts of things. There's a picture is pretty helpful, because it starts to get that sort of personal connection. Webinars should generally not be any more than 60 minutes. Why do you think 60 minutes is a good sort of figure?
Because the average attention span is about 20 minutes, so it gives you time to set up and time to disconnect.
Yeah, so you're right. You start losing people after 25, 30, maybe even stretching it to 45 might be a person's average kind of attention span, but much longer than that, you're done. And you're also, it's a little bit different. You might be able to be in a longer session where you've got people to look at, and you've got notes you can write, you've got people to talk to, you can raise your hand and ask questions. You might be able to handle a longer session face-to-face. But in a webinar, about an hour is about the longest you'd want to do. What do you think you should do if you've got lots of information that you can't do in that hour?
Schedule more than one webinar.
Schedule more than one webinar. You can do 2 of them, 3 of them. You can do a series. Every Monday for the next 4 weeks, we're doing a webinar series. Absolutely. And those are ways that you can provide more content, but in smaller chunks during the webinar. And that's a good way to keep your audience during the webinar engaged and so on. But 60 minutes, really strive to keep your webinars under 60 minutes. And that gives them a little bit, even a little bit of wrap-up time at the beginning and the end was pretty important too. You develop webinars, you want to be careful with animation. People think, oh, geez, because we can do animation, doesn't mean we should necessarily do it. Those people with soup can and string internet connections, and even people with some high-speed internet connections, you get lots of animation and transitions on your slides. There's a session on death by PowerPoint somewhere in here, and I bet you they're talking about that stuff. I bet you. But in particular, when you're online, some of those animations will be very slow and choppy, and they'll just drag. And the person can be already talking about something 2 or 3 slides later, and it's still trying to pump out that animation all the way down. So when you're creating your first webinar and you're making up some slides and so on, cool it a little bit with the animation. Make it very, very simple. Don't jazz it up with flashy stuff. So now, those are some tips on developing the content for your webinar. Now you want to host your webinar, the first thing we want to talk about is audio. What types of audio do you think you can use to host or participate in a webinar? Like what type of equipment do you think you need?
Headset and microphone.
Headset and microphone, pretty good, yeah. The best, if you're going to use headsets and microphone, are the USB ones that plug in, not the ones through the old school kind of microphone and jacks in the front. You get a little bit less interference from them. A USB headset and microphone is better. What else could you use?
Webcam mic?
Webcam mic, yeah, you can use that, but the problem with webcam mics, sometimes you get a little bit of feedback and you hear the dogs and stuff bouncing around. Anyone ever been on a webinar where dogs are barking?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's not very good, is it? And sometimes the audio is just not great between where the webcam mic is. Sometimes you have to move the monitor back and lie down on the desk to get close to it or something, right? So they're but you can host webinars by phone. And that's probably the best audio if you use a landline phone. When you start your webinar, you log in, set the webinar up, and then you dial in with a landline phone. And that's probably the best audio you'll get. It's probably the clearest, because those wires have been around for 100 years, right? Or more, probably. But the best audio you will get is from an actual landline phone. You can still use the slides and stuff on your internet connection, but try using the landline phone. You'll get the best audio. Multiple presenters. I talked a little bit about that, about having some people helping you. If you were sitting for an hour watching a box, watching a webinar, would you want to hear one person the whole time?
No.
Do you think it'd be a little bit better maybe having a couple of people talking? One does the first 15 minutes or so, another person does the next 15 minutes, and the other person comes back, kind of wraps up. Yeah. Kind of tag teaming with it. So don't think you have to do a webinar all alone. Get people to work on it with you, help you. The other benefit of the multiple presenters are having those people answering those questions, as I said a little bit earlier. Just answer the questions. They can look after some of the grunt work for you, because there are going to be people that are going to have problems. I have a question about starting new clubs. Well, instead of having that person raise their hand and interrupting the organizer, the panelists can say, hey, don't forget this is all about beer, not about new club development. And they can kind of answer those questions, and because some of the questions aren't really meant for the whole group, are they? Sometimes they're just little questions to the moderator, maybe a technical problem happens. So multiple presenters are huge, and having the moderator. So, probably the most important part, and probably why you're here, is how do we engage the people that are sitting in on this webinar to make it so that they want to be part of the webinar, they want to do another one, they want to get the training on it. Here, I can walk through and we can do little group exercises, we can do all sorts of things if we wanted to in this type of training. About a webinar, you're kind of stuck because everyone's kind of loners, maybe. Everybody's all doing their thing on their own, they're watching, and who has participated in a webinar where it just felt like it was simply a lecture? Yeah, where it's just, yap for like half an hour, 45 minutes, maybe 2 hours. Yap, and there was no interaction, nobody was asking questions, there was no engagement. Yeah, those are things, and those are probably a bigger challenge in doing a webinar for people that are hosting webinars than it is for people doing face-to-face training, because we're people. We know all that sort of engagement we do. So some of the ways you can engage your participants through the use of polls. This screen here that you'll see is the kind of screen you'll get when you start your webinar. And you'll see there's a whole bunch of things. I know it's probably pretty small. It was a little bit larger earlier, but we had to adjust the monitor. some of the aspects on this, it tells you how you can see the people that are logged in. You've got polls already set up that you can launch whenever you choose to. So during your webinar content, you can say, hey, we're going to ask what type of beer people drink, and we're going to debrief that, and we're going to talk about it. So you can have that poll already set at the right spot in the webinar. Click the launch button, select the poll, and the poll appears on the screen. And you can give your participants as long as you wish to answer the questions or take the survey on the poll. And then, once the poll is closed, then boom, the results pop up on the screen. So if you have 50 or 100 people around, just asking them their opinions through a point and click kind of thing can kind of engage them a little bit. I mentioned a little bit earlier, don't do polls just because you can. Don't do them unless you're going to do something with what the information you're asking. Don't ask them what type of beer they like to drink if you're not going to take some of that information and say that the best lager in Grand Rapids is found at such and such a brewery. So debrief the information. Use the information to enhance the content of your webinar. Go to the next one. Interaction. Allow participants the opportunity to voice their opinions on things and to participate, either by raising their hand. When they raise their hand, you can unmute the participant, and then they, if they have audio and so on, they can, they can ask a question, then you can interact with them. So make sure when you develop and do your webinars, you provide time for interaction and questions and so on. Don't just, lecture all the way along and then end the webinar at the end saying, thanks very much for your time, and out the door. You got to give people time. So if you have a webinar, design a slide so that you've got some time to take a variety of questions. What are some of the risks of asking for questions from the audience?
No answers.
No answers, yeah. Or no questions, sometimes, right? Yeah. Yeah, they might ask you a question you don't know.
Or too many questions.
Or they might ask you too many questions, right?
Or off-topic.
Or off-topic questions, yeah. So, but those are a lot of the same things that happen in this sort of session, right? When you're doing face-to-face training, you're going to get those things. If you ask a question, maybe nobody's going to answer. Then you get this dead space, right? That's a challenge when you hold webinars, is that people don't type fast enough. So sometimes you dead space while you're waiting for people to type in questions or raise their hand or whatever. They have to formulate their thoughts. And then all of a sudden the questions will show up a minute or two later during the presentation. And you're already past it because you didn't really get any feedback. Sometimes it's good to have your presenter, your organizer, and a couple of panelists have kind of a couple of stock kind of questions they can kind of throw out there to fill that dead space while people are typing and thinking of their questions or their answers and so on. So when you develop it and have a couple of those things so that, hey, we're talking about beers, so this would be a great opportunity to have one of the panelists mention what their favorite beer is and where they get their favorite beers from in Grand Rapids. So that because it does take that little bit of time for people to formulate their opinions, right? It's a little bit faster just to raise your hand and be recognized and talk here than it is to have that happen during a webinar where you might have to type. Appreciation. That's probably a little bit more important during a webinar than it is here. Because here you get visual cues and you can see different things from the presenter and from the people around you. You see people nodding and so on, you get that kind of recognition. But in a webinar, you don't. You don't see that sort of appreciation. So you have to kind of go a little bit over the top. So when people ask questions and give their opinions and comments on things that you're talking about during the webinar, make sure you're recognizing them for it. Make sure you give them appreciation and say, hey, that was a great point. Maybe ask them another follow-up question and get some more information from them so you're engaging them and working with them. It's huge. It can make a big difference in whether the person at the end of that 45 minutes or an hour feels pretty happy. We're going to talk about handouts. On this panel, there's a little spot where the handouts, you can upload more handouts during the webinar itself too if you think there's something else that someone wants. Right? This is what a panelist can be pretty good at. If the panelist is really savvy, and let's say they're talking about developing new club, and they want to now upload a document about new club development that a person just kind of requested. They can upload that during the webinar itself, so people can download that rather than having to reach out to people after the webinar and say, hey, this is what we talked about during the webinar, this and that, and so on. You can just say, hey, the panelist just uploaded a file for you. So you can grab that during the webinar. Another good thing to put in the handout section, and most of the Lions University courses do it, but they put an recognition certificate or a participation certificate right in the handouts, right? That you can just download, type in your name and go. That you've participated. That's great too, because there are lots of people who that's important to them, is that piece of paper saying, I was here. I was here, I gave up an hour of my time doing this. Maybe your district governors might want all their zone chairs to do something. Participate this way, they can kind of prove, hey, I was there and I did this. And it goes in their little toolbox, a little resume kit. So consider putting a participation certificate. As I said, I did some webinars where I had people from all over the world kind of join in. And in Asia, recognition certificates for participating in a 1-hour webinar session are huge. These people will take pictures of this webinar certificate, put it on their Facebook page, and so on, and they're so proud to do it because it's a culture in some of those countries in Asia. This is a recognition certificate, so really consider putting that into it. And then finally, about trying to engage your participants in a webinar, make sure you have a survey of some sort after the webinar is over. And you can set up a survey right when you first schedule your webinar as well. And that survey result, the survey will go out to the people just as soon as they log out. They'll get a survey, they can answer those questions, and you'll get the results. It doesn't have to be a long, involved survey. It can be 5, 6, 7 questions even, is enough to gather some information saying, hey, was the webinar effective? Were the presenters and the panelists effective at delivering the content? Are there other topics you might like? Then you can grab that information and you can really, as you do more and more online training, you can find out whether your training has been effective. So having a post survey is huge in really keeping your people engaged. So, what other strategies do you have that you think would be effective at getting your participants more engaged during a webinar? Yeah.
I think rather than just having a straight PowerPoint, that there are some links to other types of media, like going into a YouTube,
Yep.
a short little YouTube.
Yeah, you're right. Having little links to other things rather than just slides and slide and slide, death by PowerPoint. Right? We have to be careful though that some of those may not display very well, maybe on a slower internet connection. But yeah, having some links and showing some of those videos are pretty good too, or sending the links out. Sometimes those are good to have in a handout too.
Show your webcam.
Show your webcam? Yeah, not if you're wearing pants. Or only if you're wearing pants, I guess that's better, right? Because you don't want to be, as we said earlier, not turning your webcam off if you're not wearing pants. Yeah, show your webcam every now and then if you want. Again, the problem is that if you have too much of that sort of video and stuff going on, it can really slow down some of the connections for other people. But yeah, webcams, that's always good too. Yeah.
Having the participants submit a question at the beginning of the event that they know they want the answer to that question.
Yeah. Having participants do a pre-survey almost, right? Yeah. So that you can make sure that you're tailoring your content and some time in it, that you can gather the information you want to answer the question correctly. Yeah. Asking your participants to be part of the training by getting their opinions beforehand are great ways to engage people. Any other things that you think might engage a participant? And you can think back to some of the webinars you've participated in and some of the things that maybe you didn't see in those webinars and in those online trainings. What things did you feel were lacking in those that could have made it a little bit more effective for you?
I think sometimes the use of examples on slide, we hear things,
Yeah.
but we don't visualize, or it's a little bit
Yeah.
slow in the turnaround, and if we do the audio and then do the visual, it can sometimes
Yeah.
tickle the interest a little bit faster.
Exactly. You know, when you're doing face-to-face training, it's different. It really is. It's completely different. You're looking around, you're seeing people, you can demonstrate something at the same time because people are visual and so on. On a webinar, you lose some of that in some ways. So you're right, maybe talking about it first and then really getting people paying attention to the audio. People can hear it, and then they leave from the audio and they go into the aspect where they actually see it. So yeah, so let's show what we were just talking about. Yeah, so you spread it out in little pieces, in little chunks. Because people learn, some people learn by listening, some people learn by watching. Yeah. What other sort of, yeah?
Having that available, that webinar available at more than just one time.
Yes. Yeah. If all you do is make your webinar available Tuesdays at 1:30 p.m., what have you just done? Yeah, anybody who works during the day ain't going to go to the webinar, ain't going to participate in it. Now, you might be able to have a recording up later on, but it's not the same. They can view it, but they're not going to be able to ask questions and engage and some of those things. So yeah, so doing it up multiple times is always a good thing. You know, maybe have one on a weekend, one on an evening, you know, one on a weekday. So if you can do it 2 or 3 times, is not bad as well. But at a minimum, definitely post it or whatever mechanism you use in your district or in your multiple to get it so people can view it after the fact is pretty important. What other sort of strategies do you think? Yeah.
If you're trying to get people to change what they're doing and stuff like that, you may want to have a post-webinar where you're all set up to find out how do things work and then evaluate that
Yes.
with the
Yep.
people online, with the same people that you have.
Yep.
Can you set it up for 2 webinars with the same participants?
Yeah, well, yeah, you would, you know, you can send it out to, you do it as a series, I guess, or you can send it out the registration links as well. But yeah, and say, hey, you know, we just did this webinar. We'd like to have almost like a focus group almost, right? You know, the groups want to get together and talk a little bit about your experiences on this webinar. Was there any value in doing it? Was there something differently we could do? Something I found useful in my own district is participants are sometimes scared to participate in a online training for the first time. People who have never done it. A lot of businesses use it now, so it's for people in the business world, it's not too difficult. But for people who never experienced that before, they have some fear of signing into an LCI webinar where there might be 1,000 people or whatever on it, and they don't know if they're going to be pushing the right buttons and all that stuff. We do actually a pre-webinar kind of training class where it's just very loose and relaxed, and you know, anybody can sign up for it and register, and then they can kind of go through and practice some of the steps. And we bring like our district IT chairperson, and he sits in on it, and he guides them along. So if there's someone having difficulty with audio or logging in, they can, you know, he'll phone them and say, hey, check this out on your computer or whatever, and so on. So and it's very relaxed. It's without having to feel like they're on stage by being a full participant in the actual training. It's not too bad. So that comes out helpful too with some of the people both pre and post. And once you get it kind of ingrained within your district or multiple, it becomes a little more common that this is the way that we are interacting, this is the way that we are trying to reach out to more people. Any other strategies you might have, or ways that you think you might be able to engage people a little more effectively during your webinars? We have about 10 minutes left. During the forum, most of the surveys this year are being done electronically. But we do have a variety of paper surveys. So if anyone would like a paper survey, Butch will hand those out to you. And you can complete the paper survey.
Oh, that's fine. Where's the tail twister?
Where's the tail twister? Yeah, over in the back. You want a survey? We do have, yes, sure.
Not a survey.
Yeah.
So if you're doing a panel
Yeah.
and somebody raises their hand
Yes.
and to ask a question,
Yeah.
and they don't specify a particular panelist, you as the organizer, would it be recommended that you identify the panelist to answer first to keep the flow?
Yeah, maybe in that one sort of thing, yeah, you might want to say, okay, yeah, in a panel style where you may have 2 or 3 people with different topics, but you might not have that problem too much, because usually when you do a webinar, you're going to be focused on one discussion at a time, so most of your questions will probably be related to, but I kind of see what you mean, yeah, so maybe the organizer has to find out who would you like to direct this one to, and then have that, all the panelists can speak, so panelists sometimes can kind of get involved and say, oh yeah, I'll take this one because this is more my spiel, but yeah, so the person would raise their hand, and then the panelist or the organizer can unmute them, and then they can say their question, and then any panelist can do that, actually. So, but you're right, trying to find the right person to answer it might be a little more challenging. You can send a message to that person too, without having it go over audio. You can just type it in, and it shows up on their computer. And that might help too, to say, hey, who do you think could be best to answer your question, or whatever. Sometimes you might encourage people typing in their questions too, and that way you can read them and answer some of them. But yeah, you're right, it's kind of, if you have a panelist where you've got 3 or 4, it can be difficult, couldn't it? Is that the kind of the question you're asking?
It is.
Yeah. Yeah. So. Anyone else have any questions?
Are there any free webinar providers that you work with that you think are useful?
Well, even GoToWebinar gives you like 30 days or 60 days or something free, I think. Oovo is free, I believe.
How do you spell that?
OOVOO. I believe it's free. Now, the difference with some of the free ones through some of the other ones, you might get ads at the bottom, you might get, you might limit the number of participants you might be able to have a little bit more stringent. But like I said, GoToWebinar gives you 30 days at least to try, and you can host a couple. But getting even a multiple or whatever to stick it into their budget is a great way to do it, and then the districts can steal it whenever they want to, right? Is not a bad idea. But it's $1,000 a year, so it's a sizable thing, but it saves you a lot of meeting costs, doesn't it?
From Multiple 5M, we've purchased GoToWebinar now for our multiple for our districts to use for meetings and such. So
it does. If you consider bringing, let's say, district chair people in to travel to one meeting is a huge cost, isn't it? With hotels and travel costs, all the other things you might. But webinar, you can do it. You have a meeting and so on.
You make it sound very simple. Are there tutorials with a GoTo?
Bingo. That was that. Yes.
And what goes wrong? What happens?
Well, we'll start off with yes. There are great tutorials on GoToMeet, and they're little videos, and they guide you through, and they're maybe 5-10 minutes or so, right? It gives you a really good feel for how to set up, participate. They've got them for participants. So the first webinars you do, sending out participant one, the link to the participant one's good. But the other ones for hosting them are great too, because they've got some great information. But disasters during a webinar, yeah. Power outages are bad. No matter what you do, you always get one guy on the webinar who it seems like his audio doesn't work, and you get the whoa, 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 whoa kind of noise, and you get all sorts of nasty little things. And sometimes you just, every time he goes to talk, it kind of goes whoa, 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 whoa. You have to just kind of keep on muting him, and you have to say, just type it in, and so you get a lot of audio issues. I think are probably, I would say, 80% of the issues you have with a webinar are audio. And that's why I really think if you stress the type of equipment you use during a webinar, it is a huge help. So recommend that your people use a headset and microphone, a USB preferably, a landline phone if they can is a big help. But try to get them to avoid using just the built-in mic or built-in speakers just on their laptop or whatever, because they're just usually nowhere near as effective. But as we talked a little bit earlier, the problem is that most people are using iPads now and so on, and they don't have a way to plug that stuff in, so that's a little bit different. But then again, tablets quite often have far better audio on them than your laptop does, so it's so they've got better noise canceling and that kind of thing, so you might find it very effective. Anyone else have any other questions?
Somehow I missed the very beginning concept of you're paying some money for this, and somebody has it, and then you started it. How do you, like you talked about.
Oh, yeah, so you pay some money. So you have to purchase.
Who, how?
Well, in our multiple uses it as part of our GMT and our GLT budget. We budget funds towards purchasing an annual subscription to the GoToWebinar service. And what that allows us to do is conduct unlimited amounts of webinars and meetings throughout the year. And it's, what did you say, $100 a month?
Yep, $99.99.
It's $100 a month.
So once it's budgeted,
Yep.
the GLT person goes online and...
Well, what we do is we have our council secretary has one account, and then if anyone requests it, then they just use that account and they set up and schedule the meeting and schedule the webinar, and they send out, he just has a little document he uses, he sends out telling you how to log in. We just use one login.
He controls the calendar.
Yeah, make sure we're not
And
in
he
it.
also sends you out the instructions as to how to log in and the passwords required to log in under our ID.
Yeah, so really for $1,000, it seems like a decent chunk of change. But I can tell you,
I signed the checks last.
we have, I bet you our multiple does 100, 150 meetings online annually for it. Plus, the districts share it and use it whenever they want to have online meetings. So a lot of the governor teams have online meetings and online webinars and so on as well. Some of the districts do webinar training and that kind of thing. So it's used 300 times a year, I don't know. So on average, it's $3 a meeting, it's for $3 a training, and I bet you a room like this isn't $3. Guaranteed.
Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other last few questions before we wrap up?
The only thing I noticed with some of the university webinars is if you can't take them and you have to go back to the pre-recorded, the recorded one, you can't make them full screen.
Oh, really?
They stay small.
Yeah.
I've done everything I can to get it full screen. Just some of the earlier ones. Later on, they got better, but right at the beginning, you're kind of going, okay, what did they do?
Maybe it was some
Little hard to
software
read
they
the
used at the
slides.
very beginning
Yeah.
to record some of the very early ones on.
So I didn't know if there's
Okay.
something when you're recording it or something when you're doing it that.
I honestly won't know what happened.
Okay.
Can you still right-click to save the whatever's on your screen?
Sometimes, some of them are embedded on the website and you can't download them, so. But that's a possibility too, you might be able to download the PowerPoint.
I tried.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know, I'd have to take a look and see how they're configured.
You always say that any question is not a dumb question.
No
Okay.
questions are dumb.
You said this is part of the doctorate.
Yep.
Is this available today to get the credit for
They're
it?
recording it. They're recording it right there.
Okay.
So I'm assuming it will be uploaded next few days.
Next few days, probably. Yep.
And then there'll be a quiz involved. It's about 8 to 10 questions. Like I said, I'll take cash.
I take notes.
You take notes, so. Yes, and then of course you'll be able to view it and pause it, whatever else you want to do too. So. Absolutely. I'd like to thank you all for your participation, and I hope you have a great rest of the floor. And we are. Any of the surveys that you want completed, just pass them over.